Thanks everybody for sticking around. I know some of you have been sitting for 2 hours since your first beer, and that's not an easy thing to do. So we'll try to make this really interesting. I want to thank the warm-up acts for setting us up for success. Appreciate that, just joking. Dan Steinman, I am currently self-titled GM of EMEA for Gainsight, having been the Chief Customer Officer there for 4 years. We're here ostensibly to talk about scaling, but inevitably this conversation will turn towards customer success, since all three of us, that's what we do for a living. So if you don't know Gainsight, we're a software application for customer success to drive retention, right? It's all an output of the subscription economy, where you have to pay more attention to your customers. Technology then can help that. So that's myself, Dan and Rav. I'm really pleased to have two friends up here, as well as co-journeyers on this customer success path, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Dan, you want to go first?
Hi, my name is Dan Farkkas, and I head customer success at Box in EMEA. Box is a cloud content management solution. We quite often known as the enterprise file sync and share solution, but we're moving towards the enterprise content management space. I've been at Box for 3.5 years. I joined in 2013, and I've grown the team a bit here in EMEA as well. So we effectively look after customers. So it's a fantastic place to be, and seeing them being successful, using also Gainsight in doing so is a great experience. So that's me.
Good evening, everyone. We're standing between you and a drink. I'm very conscious of that. So my name is Dhaliwal. I'm from Slack Technologies. You may have heard we're a messaging app. I believe we're the fastest growing enterprise SaaS app in history. I'm first boots on the ground here in London, which is why I have a lot of grey hair. And I run the customer success and services team for Europe.
Awesome. I was standing next to Rav when Stephen said something about getting to 100 million in 9 years. And to his credit, he didn't laugh out loud, but I think Slack did that in 9 days, I think, didn't they? Something like that, anyway. So what better folks to talk about scaling than Box and Slack? And I'll add tiny little comments from little old Gainsight as well. So let's talk about that, you guys. The subject is scaling. So just tell me, how long you've been at Box, Dan, and what scale has happened during that time? Because every phase is different. And give me some numbers, either number of employees or revenue, if you can share it, or number of customers, whatever those things are that tell us what that scale looks like.
Yeah, so I joined Box in 2013, and it was actually mid-2013. In EMEA, we literally just opened the office, so I was employee maybe number like 45, 50. In Box, employee perhaps 800, and I think since then we have pretty much doubled the size of the business from the employee standpoint. We have done multiple that in terms of revenue standpoint. My team when I joined was 3 people, now it's 30, so we 10x that as well. So actually it's been a very, very fast growth. It was actually an interesting experience, because when I joined, and I mentioned earlier the enterprise file sync and share, that was the market we were in back then. And we were actually looking at the inflection point of actually going and becoming a kind of a horizontal solution for most of the enterprises. And that was a huge change for us. So we actually kind of came up with a new offering. We actually were going to go for an IPO, which actually happened shortly after. And a lot of things changed since I joined. So great experience.
Tell us your scale story.
I'm trying to remember it now. That's right. So I first got introduced to Slack in June of 2015, just through a mutual connection. I was actually working at Zendesk, which was one of the companies mentioned earlier. The company was about 85 people at the time. I then ended up joining 7 months later in November, and I was in the class that pushed it over to 300. So fast forward to today, we are just pushing just under 900 people. I think in that time, from that very first conversation, Slack had just hit, I think, 1 million daily active users. I think at the end of last year, we hit 6.8 million weekly active users and just under 4 million daily. So that's been like a pretty phenomenal sort of growth in terms of users. Here in EMEA, we're still a little bit smaller than the rest of the company, but we're rapidly scaling up. Dublin is our HQ for Europe. London's still very small, but we're moving in a couple of weeks, and we've got about 35 desks to fill this year. So there's a lot of work to be done.
By the way, sometime soon, Rob is going to write a book on how to pick the right companies to work for, because I believe the resume says Salesforce, Yammer, Zendesk, and now Slack. So if you want to make some money, follow this guy around, take his resume, copy it or something. So growth is obviously a really good thing, but it does pose a lot of challenges. So just each of you guys take a turn talking about some of the cracks that got exposed as you saw that growth happening, and then maybe a little bit, this is again still at the company level, we'll talk about customers in a minute, but talk about cracks that got exposed and how the company correctly or incorrectly addressed or didn't address those things.
Yeah, so I think the focus in our case had to be pretty much around the people, and it's been mentioned here before, kind of the systems and processes we had around the company as we were growing globally, and also the culture which we actually want to keep consistent as we grow. So kind of starting with the people, obviously me here kind of being one of the first joiners in EMEA had to be about, you have to go and hire really, really fast. And you kind of end up kind of facing that challenge of, do I hire fast or do I hire with the right people? So actually always better on hiring the right people, so I would kind of keep to that. But it's one of the first challenges you've got. In terms of processes and the systems you've got, they actually get under pressure, kind of especially globally. So you actually have a lot of young people joining the company, everyone's got great ideas, there's unlimited problems to solve, and they start running in every single direction. So kind of herding them together, getting them to actually follow one path, choosing the problems you want to actually go and solve, and resolving as a company is a big thing. Now, globally, it's even worse because actually you've got EMEA now going a different direction than the US, so actually you have to bring that together as well. So I would say as we fix that, as we actually established proper global kind of function, I think we got over the problems of scaling, and now we actually scale in a much more efficient way. Actually, we save, I would say, some money we would have spent on hiring people we might not even need along the way. So that'd be me.
Yeah, Rob, cracks that you've seen and how you're addressing those.
Basically everything Dan said there, pretty much. Yeah, I think hiring definitely, not hiring quick enough, maybe not investing in actual local recruiting quick enough. I think that's probably a key learning. And on the tool side, I think one of the challenges when you're scaling really, really fast is you're actually pretty reactive. So everyone's wearing like multiple hats. Every day there's a new thing coming in, and you're just reacting. It's like, we need to do this. And then not actually having a mechanism to record what you're doing and how long it's taking and what the outcome of that is. You really realize after a while that actually causes you a lot of pain, because you start establishing sort of norms and practices which actually might not be very sensible to continue doing, because you were just doing them while you were reactive. So, and I speak from the pain of trying to aggregate like a year and a half's worth of where we have spent our time, and actually realizing I had to piece all that together manually, right? And when you start looking at cause and effect, you realize that in the early days, we were actually spending far too much time on stuff that wasn't impactful, not just for us, but actually not for our customers either. So I think that on the tools and processes front, thinking about that much earlier is definitely like a crack that I think we would probably look at to solving in a different way.
Yeah, it's one of the fundamental truths of startup companies is that when you're growing, you hire a lot of people early on who are just scrappy and just figure out how to get things done. But somewhere in the midst of that craziness, you got to start figuring out process. And if you don't do that, you don't have a chance. And it's doubly hard because in the midst of hypergrowth, where you've got people who have figured out just how to go get things done, to enforce process on them and start hiring people who really do understand process causes a lot of pain too. And then what happens, what Steven talked about, is teams start to turn over, because some people love that startup phase, that scrappy phase where they crawl under the desk doing, connecting cables one day and then they're writing software the next day. Some people love that and can't get out of that, and they need to move on. And I think it's part of what we have to accept as leaders in companies, that that's okay, right? The idea of the alliance is really true. It's not a forever thing, and every person has stages that they're good at and some that they aren't. So
I would just pick up on that. Is that absolutely key point? And I think the first sign of that is when someone says, "Oh, but that's not how we do things here," or "That's not consistent with our culture." And one of the things that, it's a term that I've coined, is you can sometimes find what I call culture hijackers. So in order to kind of maintain the status quo, or like, I don't want to do process, I don't want to do procedure, I don't want to log that in Salesforce, because it's antithetical to our culture, and really it's just a bit of an excuse to maintain the status quo. So I think as leaders, that's definitely something to keep a very close eye and ear out for too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the process is also very, actually I come from, before I joined Box, I was in Accenture, so for me process was something I would do all day long, and I probably enjoyed that at some point. Then I came to Box and I kind of realized actually there's a process and this kind of semi-process you do, and I actually had to scale back on my wanting to do process, because that could really go on forever. So I think there's a healthy medium between the two. I would just say kind of around all this is the culture, which I didn't talk about a lot. I think as a company, you have a culture which wants to disrupt something and we actually wants to do things differently. And it's also driving a lot of these behaviors, but you don't want that to go away. So as you actually start implementing this process into it, and you scare some people who go like, oh wow, this is actually no longer the company I joined, it's a company which feels like maybe Accenture again, and that's not what we actually came here to do. So actually have to be very careful actually how far you go. So I think finding the right balance, which actually underpins the culture of creativity, doing things in an interesting way, having fun along the way, is super, super important. So be yourself, but just make it scalable, I think.
I would just add to that, and it's related to some of the sessions earlier. The culture piece is actually absolutely critical, but also having some diversity of staff and diversity of thinking. So if you're growing really quick and you need to hire, there's a tendency to kind of hire from the same pool, or maybe from the same set of companies. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you want to find that you want to get the people with the right level of maturity who actually understand it's going to be different, and I have to accept it's different. So one of the questions I get asked all the time is, oh, how come you didn't hire so-and-so back? Or how come? It's like, because we're not going to get any diversity of thinking, and we'll just recreate the same problems again as well. So I think that's another key thing, that diversity of who you hire.
Yeah, by the way, there's a learning aspect here that really applies to both internally at a company, but also as software vendors. I'm assuming many of you guys are also software companies. The reason that customer success exists in general is because there's always inertia to keep doing things the way you used to do them. And software companies develop things that make that path easier in theory. But as you all know, I hope you all know that, you can't send out logins and passwords to your software and assume everyone's just going to pick it up and start using it. You have to change the inertia of doing it the old way and getting people to do it the new way. It's really, in some ways, that's the definition of customer success. But Rob and Dan are talking about that same thing exists within our companies. As we grow, the inertia of doing things the way we used to do them is really strong. That's just natural human behavior. And somehow as leaders, we have to force people out of that, both in using a piece of software, also in the way that we used to do things, and that's not how we do them anymore. And you can't grow up as a company unless you do it that way. This is one of the hardest things about scaling, is it does leave some people behind who refuse to change. And that's fine, because they can probably go find another company that fits in the stage of maturity where they should be. But it is hard because you end up leaving really good people behind sometimes, and those are hard decisions. So let's talk a little bit about customer success, since that's essentially what we think we know something about. So as you guys have, obviously, as the companies scale, the number of customers scale, this means that the sales and marketing engine is working pretty well. Sometimes the customer aspect of that is the very end of the tail being wagged by the dog, and we feel slighted in that. But talk about the scale of customers, Dan, and what specifically you've done to start addressing that, because as we all know, you can't treat every customer the same. At some point, you have to think about that differently. So just talk about what your journey has been in addressing the scaling number of customers.
That's right. So as we evolved, our customer success operation initially started on looking, and as you would normally, at the gross retention of your customers. So you close your customers, you want to keep your customers, you retain your customers, you retain. As you actually grow your maturity of the customer success function, you start looking at the expansion of the customers you already had before. So for that, you need slightly different tools. That's exactly what Dan was just describing around your people not only trying to tell the customer how to use your tool so they stay with you, it's about how to change their thinking around the way they're going to go to cloud, about the way they're going to transform their business, and kind of growing with you as their partner and a vendor to actually achieve more. So actually moves towards the net retention factor. So we actually had to start explaining to our people how to have these conversations, how to strategically bring insights to our customers to do things differently. Now, you kind of invest into those conversations for the customer success managers that actually manage the larger customers. But the next stage after that is start thinking around a lot of the smaller customers you've got and how can you address those? How can you bring value to them at scale? So I think in the customer success world, everyone will tell you that kind of almost every company has nailed the high-touch customer management. Not many companies yet figured out how to do it at scale, and that's where we're focusing right now. So that's going to actually kind of break through the issues we will have, and we already do have with growing really, really fast, and focusing on providing the value to customers that are tiny, and you can not spend the one-on-one, the face time with them all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates a great deal. I think that there is always that conundrum of, you know, the long tail versus that high touch. But I think one of the approaches that we've taken is that we've very much looked at the problem of customer success as really a change management problem. So what we're asking customers to do, whether it's our product or Gainsight or whatever, is we're asking them to change the way they work. And that's really hard. I got a colleague of mine who is very fond of saying the only person who likes change is a wet baby. And, you know, like, it's very, very true. And so what we decided to do was to take an approach of systematizing all of our learning about what makes a successful change, and then building a bunch of assets that any customer could use, small or large. And essentially it takes the form of a workbook and other bits and pieces. It's like, step through this, check through this. These are all the elements to successfully go through a change. Because as much as we try and as hard as effort we put in, you can't impose change from the outside. You know, it has to be driven from inside. Now, where we have those larger customers, we do put a team on the ground to help facilitate that. But we've seen pretty good success with the customers we don't get a lot of touch with by having that self-service model. And eventually, I think what we're going to do is make that part of the web experience so people actually can log on and actually go through that change process online, as well as through assets that we've created. So we've definitely, I mean, if we rename the team, it would be Change and Adoption Team. You know, that's pretty much what we do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It really is about change management. Make a comment about customer success in general, since we've kind of watched this industry very, very closely. For those of you who haven't invested yet, it's never too early. Jason Lemkin, who many of you guys have heard of, wrote a blog post a few years ago saying customer success should be a single-digit hire, meaning it should be one of your first 9 people who understands and is going to be responsible for and driving customer success, which ultimately leads to retention. But the customer success world's changed a lot in the last 4 years. In particular, I used to hire CSMs when they would, at least in part, when they would tell me that their greatest strength was they built great relationships with their customers. And that was what we did, right? That's what it was about, was really CRM, the fulfillment of the CRM promise, with the R meaning relationship. But in the last 4 years, that has changed dramatically, especially at scaling companies, but even at small companies, in that is not the key skill set anymore. It has to be, I'd much rather hear someone answer that question by saying, you give me however many customers you want, you give me a fair retention goal, and I'll figure out how to make that number, right? It's not about building relationships, because the SaaS world begs for a long tail. SaaS makes it so easy to buy products. That's why the markets are so much bigger. When you get a long tail, you cannot build loyalty by building relationships with your customers. The only thing that builds loyalty, frankly, is your product. And the product needs some help from people saying, here's why it's valuable, here's the value you're getting out of it. So start thinking about customer success early, but start thinking about it as a process-driven, metrics-driven organization, because it's easy to ease into it thinking about relationships. As Rob or Dan said, there's 1 million people out there who could manage your high-touch accounts. Give me one $2 million account. I can find 1 million people out there who will manage that account really well. The number of people who could manage $1,000 a year accounts effectively with a decent retention rate is very, very close to zero. There's almost no one who's ever done that. It's not that it can't be done. There's certainly a way to do it, but you will not see any resumes saying that somebody has done that, because there aren't anybody. There's just not anybody out there. So, and you have to think about that early on, because as SaaS companies, you guys are going to end up with a long tail of low value customers who in aggregate are really valuable, but individually you can't spend a lot of time with them. So you got to think about how to scale. And of course, technology has to be part of the answer to that question. So let's take a look at Slido. I love Slido. I'll tell you a quick story. The first time I ever used it, I was hosting a CEO panel. I had 4 CEOs on the panel, and I thought Slido was pretty cool because I didn't have to do as much work as a moderator. I could just pick questions off. And then I looked at Slido, and it said, how come there's 4 white guys on your panel? And I'm like, the Slido thing really sucks, right? I don't want to answer that question, and neither do any of these guys on my panel. It was a very fair question. We did get around to it. It took us a little while. I figured I'd give everyone else the chance to see it and formulate an answer before I sprung it on them.
And you fixed it.
Yeah, and we fixed it right away. Yeah, we got 2 women to come up from the crowd. Anyway, so let's take a look at this first one. How do you typically remunerate CS teams that aren't directly involved in renewals? Really quick answer from me. Somebody does not have to be directly involved in a transaction to get rewarded for it. And the perfect example is in your sales organization, you often have SEs, right? How many deals do SEs close in a year? Exactly 0. How many negotiations do they do? 0. How many terms and conditions do they review and redline or respond to red lines? 0. How do you compensate them? On how many deals get closed. You can have an impact and be measured on something that you are not actually transacting. That's my answer to this question. If you don't have CSMs doing the renewal, that doesn't mean you can't hold them accountable for it, because every single thing they do, and I mean every single thing they do, should lead to a higher likelihood of renewal and upsell. So the ultimate measure of customer success is net retention. Are customers renewing, and are they buying more? So I'll let each of you guys pick a question off of Slido that you're comfortable answering.
Oh, I was just going to answer that one.
You can do that one too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I actually have so in my team, I've got customer success managers, and they're separated from the renewals team. You always have kind of advantages of that process, or you got disadvantages. So the way we decided to do it this way in our case is when I've got my renewals team engaging with the customer, they come from the commercial angle, whereas the CSMs don't. The customers know the CSMs are not there because of the commercial interest, so they are there to actually get them deployed. So very often I shall literally see very often that the CSMs get access to information from the customer that no one else does, because the customer don't feel they actually have to buy another license because the CSMs came to talk to them. They came there for reasons of getting value on what they already purchased. So for me, for us, the CSMs have a base salary, but they have an opportunity to find use cases which actually allow us to then go and upsell or cross-sell our other products. So they actually they can get extra spiffs or bonus based on identifying those use cases, but their primary focus is actually getting the book of business and employing it as fast as possible, and ideally over-deploy wherever they can.
So I think there's a couple of different ways to think about this, and Slack's been really interesting for me because this is the first time I've run a success team as part of sales. So we're actually in the sales organization, and that actually works remarkably well. There's a lot less internal orchestration overhead about working out where you're going to prioritize your time, etc. And to Dan's point, we don't want our guys to act commercially. We want them to think commercially. We want them to think about what's the best interest for the customer here and for us. So we're actually just aligned to the regional sales goals for ARR growth and also a smaller percentage on ACV. And that's because we do actually spend quite a lot of material effort helping to close deals, specifically pilots. I mean, that's just by nature of our product. People are like, I'm sold on the technology, but I want to see if it's valuable for the business. So I want to actually run it with 200, 300, 400 people. And that involves a fair bit of work on our side. So I think there's a number of different approaches to how you might want to compensate. But I think Dan's point is the key one, is you can absolutely get remunerated for something which you may not necessarily be accountable for delivering. And I think that's a really key point.
Yeah, just to stay on this question for a second, because it's so important, and it's probably the question I get asked the most often. There's a really clear analogy, I think, with sales, and everyone understands sales. So anything you can use as an analogy to sales, people tend to get. In sales, we think about paying people only for one thing, right? Only when they close deals. Would you ever pay sales guys for the number of calls they make or the number of proposals they send out? The answer is no, right? You pay people for results. What do you measure to know whether you're going to drive those results? In sales, it's pipeline. Is the pipeline growing and is it moving, right? That is your leading indicator of whether you're going to get the results you want. Now the question is, what are the activities that drive the pipeline, right? Number of calls, obviously, number of meetings, number of proposals, whatever those things are. So you manage activities, measure the leading indicator, which is pipeline, compensate on results. Customer success is the same process, different things. The result is net retention. Successful customers do two things: renew their contracts, buy more stuff. What is the leading indicator? The leading indicator is health score. Whether you call it that or something else, or however you measure it, there is a concept in your company of how healthy is a customer. If you have a customer success manager and you say, how's Acme Manufacturing doing? They'll have an answer to that question, and that answer will be, how healthy is that customer? Well, you know, the boss who bought it really likes it because he loves this monthly report, but the users don't like the UI, so we have some trouble there. What they're describing is customer health. So the leading indicator for customer success is the health of a customer, because that's the indicator of whether you're going to get that result. Now what you have to figure out is, what are the activities that drive the health score up, which is the leading indicator of the result that you want. Those activities you'll figure out: number of meetings, number of calls, health checks, instantership. Really good question. One comment on Rob's comment about being in sales: there is no right or wrong organization when it comes to customer success. There's no right or wrong model, whether a CSM should do renewals or upsell. There really isn't. There's ways to make all of this work. The sales oversight of customer success is an interesting model. One significant advantage: if the sales guy sells something, he has to live with the result of that. It's a little bit like putting customer support under engineering. Yeah, you can ship that code if you want to. Guess who gets to live with the result? Yeah, you can sell that customer if you want to, but guess who lives with the result, right? And it's not always in sales. There's certain things that would say maybe it's not the best place, but in the long run, it doesn't matter. So this question of chief revenue officer versus separate sales CS leadership, I'm not sure those things are necessarily related. CRO is a title that gets used a lot, but sometimes it means someone who just sits over the top of the VP of sales. Sometimes it's over VP of sales and marketing, because that's the revenue funnel. Very seldom does someone think about CRO as the person who would also run customer success, because customer success is usually seen as the post-sales organization, right? So I think an ideal organization for a CEO, if he can find the right people and can afford it, is CRO runs marketing and sales, CEO or COO runs operations and engineering and finance and all that, and CCO runs the entire customer lifecycle. That's one way to think about it. It's one of the ways I think about it. Guys?
I think I fully agree with what you said, Dan. I think it's also really down to how you really incentivize the people, as you were talking about earlier. Obviously, in customer success, we are there for the long term. So for us, a customer who basically might grow in the next 2 to 3 years is absolutely fine. We will invest the time, we'll invest the care, and we'll try to grow them over time. Now, if you have in a sales organization, you typically want to get to something in the next quarter, the next month. It's kind of driven kind of month on month very often, or quarter on quarter. Whereas we actually, if you actually give us the time to grow the portfolio, we'll actually be able to build it over time. That's going to be our next sales target, maybe next year. So having them separate is probably okay. Now, if you actually put it all under revenue, that's what we care about, the revenue, and we actually focus on that. If you put it on the sales, then it all needs to support the sales cycle. If it's all customer success, it's going to be all about net retention. So it's really pretty much where your company is, but you're going to get what you actually, how you structure it, is what you're going to get out of it. So you have to remember that. So keep that in mind. Yeah.
By the way, Box is the company, I think, as a public company, that's kind of set the mark from a customer success standpoint, being centric on customer success. And they've kind of made life really difficult for the rest of us, because they've touted their net retention number from the time they filed their S1, 131%. Every quarterly earnings report has that number in it, and sets the bar really high. I mean, that is world class, and not everyone can get there. It depends a little bit, but in some cases I love Box because they're a great customer of ours and good people, but that little thing kind of irks me sometimes, like, quit setting the bar so high, just come down to real life at some point, so the rest of us don't have to try to jump over that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would again echo the sentiment. I don't think there's any right or wrong way of doing it. Obviously, metrics govern behavior. I think some of the things I've seen work really well is having some shared metrics between the sales organization and the success organization. In our case, we have a very unique challenge at Slack. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, we have this thing called a fair billing model. So you only pay by usage. So if someone stops using a product for 14 days, we'll give you the money back. Like we pro rata you the money back, which makes maintaining that growth, something we really have to keep our eye on, because there's a seasonal adjustment, but if people stop using it, they get all these credits, right? So we share that goal with the sales organization. So there's not an incentive for them to sell and then just walk away to the next thing. They want to make sure the customers like onboarded, launched, and that ARR consumption is really quick, because then they know that's taken care of. So I think having a shared goal, whether you report up into different lines, I think is probably a key way to maybe overcome that challenge.
Yeah, if you really want to prioritize customer success as a company, do a consumption model or something like that, where you don't get paid unless they use your product. It'll get significant focus really early on. Yeah. By the way, just kidding aside, that model is really awesome, because that forces your growth to correlate with your customers' growth. So if customers are getting value out of your product, they grow faster, they have to pay you more money.
Yeah, and it also forces you to do the right things as well.
That's right. Exactly. So I think we're up on time and even over. So thank you guys for sticking around. We really appreciate that, and hope to catch up with you guys over a beer later.